It began with a word chosen to land like a slap. When Donald Trump referred to Mark Carney as governor, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a message. In Trump's worldview, titles are power markers. You don't demote someone verbally unless you want to test whether they'll accept it. Calling Canada's leader a governor wasn't about ego. It was about hierarchy, about signaling that Canada should be treated not as a sovereign equal, but as a regional appendage, economically useful, politically subordinate, strategically disposable. Chess players recognize this move. You tap a piece, not to take it, but to see if the board shakes. Trump expected noise, outrage, a press conference, flags and fury. That's how he's always operated. Provoke, escalate, dominate the cycle. Bullying works best when the other side reacts emotionally, when they rush to the microphone, when they play checkers while you flip the table. But the insult landed in a very different mind. Carney didn't fire back. No tweet, no speech, no symbolic retaliation. To Washington pundits, the silence looked like weakness. To markets, it looked like uncertainty. And to anyone who understands power, it looked like preparation. Because here's the truth most Americans are never told. Words don't run countries. Systems do. Energy flows do. Supply chains do. The grid does. Trump spoke as if this were a media skirmish, another headline war he could win by sheer volume. But Canada doesn't need to shout to be heard. It sits upstream, literally, electrically, economically. And when you insult someone who controls the valves, you'd better be sure they're the kind who bluffs. This wasn't a gaffe. It was a probe. Trump wanted to see if Canada would flinch. Instead, Canada went quiet. And when a country with leverage goes quiet, that's when the real danger begins. Silence was the answer, and it was deliberate. While Washington waited for a rebuttal, Mark Carney boarded a plane and went home. No cameras, no statements, no theatrical outrage to feed the American news cycle. To casual observers, it looked like retreat. To anyone who understands how modern power actually works, it was something else entirely. Carney understands a rule Trump never learned. The loudest player is usually the weakest one. Back in Canada, there was no rush to defend pride or posture. There was a shift in focus, from language to infrastructure, from politics to mechanics. Because retaliation doesn't have to be visible to be effective. It only has to be precise. Carney's background isn't in slogans or rallies. It's in systems, central banks, financial plumbing, stress points you don't see until they break. He knows where pressure accumulates and how little force it takes to trigger a cascade. That's the difference between a brawler and a surgeon. In Washington, Donald Trump mistook the quiet for submission. That miscalculation matters. Bullies depend on feedback. They need resistance to calibrate the next shove. When nothing comes back, they assume the other side is cornered. But Canada wasn't cornered. It was counting. Energy flows, transmission lines, export contracts written with technical language most politicians never read. Clauses that don't scream retaliation, but whisper review. These aren't weapons you brandish. They're switches you flip. Carney didn't need to threaten. He didn't need to warn. He simply needed time. Time to let bureaucratic processes begin moving in ways that look boring on paper and devastating in practice. Technical assessments, grid reliability studies, domestic priority reviews, all legal, all justified, all invisible until the lights flicker. This is what strategic restraint looks like in the 21st century. Not tanks, not tariffs. Leverage embedded in infrastructure so deeply that the people depending on it don't even realize who holds the keys. The American media missed it completely. They're trained to hear sound, not silence. But energy markets listen differently. They listen for risk, for uncertainty, for the possibility, however small, that tomorrow won't look like yesterday. And when a country that supplies your power stops talking and starts calculating, that's not diplomacy. That's positioning. The move came wrapped in paperwork, not threats. Canada announced a technical review of its hydroelectric and natural gas exports, language so dry it barely registered on cable news. No sanctions, no embargo, no violation of treaties, just a reassessment, officials said, to ensure domestic energy security amid rising global uncertainty. That phrase should have set off alarms, because Canada isn't just an energy exporter, It's an energy spine. Vast portions of the northern United States, New England, the Midwest, parts of the Pacific Northwest, run on Canadian power. Hydro from Quebec, natural gas from Alberta. Electricity that crosses borders every second, silently, keeping hospitals lit and factories running. This wasn't about shutting anything off. That's the amateur's move. This was about signaling that the flow was no longer guaranteed to be frictionless. Under the review, priority shifted, subtly but legally, toward Canadian households, Canadian industry, Canadian reserves. Export volumes weren't canceled, they were placed under scrutiny. Maintenance schedules were re-examined, capacity buffers recalculated, transmission reliability reassessed under new risk assumptions. In plain English, Canada reminded the United States that it controls the upstream valves. And here's what makes it lethal. Energy systems don't tolerate uncertainty. They're built on assumptions: steady supply, predictable pricing, uninterrupted flow. The moment those assumptions wobble, everything downstream starts to shake. Grid operators don't wait for outages. They panic early. They hedge. They buy at higher prices. They warn regulators. Markets don't care whether a review is symbolic or real. They care that it could become real. This is where Mark Carney played the long game. He didn't need to pull the lever. He just needed everyone to see his hand resting on it. The genius of the move was its deniability. If challenged, Canada could point to climate volatility, infrastructure aging, domestic demand growth. All true, all documented, all defensible in court. There was no single decision to reverse, only a process already in motion. Trump's team framed power as something you seize loudly. Carney used power the way modern states actually do, embedded in systems so complex that by the time politicians notice, the costs are already being paid. And those costs weren't theoretical. They were about to show up somewhere Americans understand immediately, on their bills. The reaction was instant and unforgiving. Energy markets don't wait for confirmation. They trade on fear, probability, and worst-case math. The moment Canada's review hit the wires, traders recalculated risk, not because exports had stopped, but because they might not be as cheap, smooth, or guaranteed tomorrow. Natural gas prices jumped first. Futures contracts widened. Utilities that depend on steady Canadian supply scrambled to lock in alternatives, bidding against one another in real time. That bidding war didn't stay on Wall Street. It moved straight into the wholesale electricity markets that determine what power actually costs to produce. Grid operators began issuing quiet alerts, not public warnings, those come later, but internal notices, stress scenarios, margin calls, contingency planning. When supply assumptions wobble, operators overcorrect. They buy more power than they need, earlier than they planned, at higher prices than they budgeted. That overcorrection becomes your bill. Wholesale electricity prices spiked across northern U.S. regions within days. Utilities don't absorb those costs, they pass them through, sometimes immediately, sometimes with a delay, but always eventually. The extra dollars don't disappear. They accumulate, line by line, until they land in monthly statements that working families can't avoid. This is how leverage works in real life. No blackout required, no dramatic shutdown, just enough instability to make the system protect itself at the consumer's expense. Trump dismissed the coverage as hysteria. Fake news, he said, waving it off as media exaggeration. But markets don't care what presidents say. They care what contracts imply. And the contracts now carried a new word everyone hates: uncertainty. Power grids are built like tightropes, not highways. There's very little slack. When one major supplier hints, even legally, even politely, that conditions may change, the entire structure tenses. Costs rise not because energy vanished, but because trust did. And here's the part no one spells out on cable news. This wasn't a punishment aimed at Washington. It was a pressure wave that rolled straight through state regulators, municipal utilities, and rural cooperatives. It hit retirees on fixed incomes, factory towns already squeezed by inflation, people who don't follow geopolitics, but understand when their lights cost more to keep on. That's why this move worked. It didn't target pride, it targeted math. By the time politicians started arguing about tone and respect, the damage was already priced in. The market had made its judgment, and it was telling everyone the same thing. Canada didn't need to escalate. It only needed to remind the system who it depends on. That's when Washington realized the fire wasn't on television, it was in the control rooms. Publicly, Donald Trump kept up the performance. He mocked the concern. He denied the leverage. He told reporters the United States had plenty of energy and that Canada needed America more than the other way around. Classic dominance theater. Say it loud enough and hope reality blinks first. Reality didn't blink. Behind closed doors, the mood flipped from bravado to alarm. State governors started getting calls from utilities. Utility CEOs started calling regulators. Regulators started running numbers that didn't look survivable. And suddenly, the White House wasn't the center of gravity anymore, because energy doesn't answer to press secretaries. Governors from energy-dependent states quietly, urgently began bypassing federal channels. No statements, no leaks, just direct outreach north. They weren't calling to posture, they were calling to stabilize. They wanted assurances, timelines, clarifications, anything that would calm markets before the next trading cycle opened. Some asked whether the review could be slowed. Others asked what signals might convince traders that flows would remain steady. This wasn't diplomacy, it was damage control. And every one of those calls carried the same unspoken admission. The United States could not afford a disruption, even a symbolic one. This is the moment the power dynamics snapped into focus. Trump's strategy depends on centralization, everything running through him. Every confrontation turned into a personal contest of wills. But energy systems don't work that way. They're federalized, privatized, fragmented, vulnerable. When pressure hits, the system routes around the noise and goes straight to the source of stability. That source was Mark Carney. And Carney didn't rush to reassure. He didn't issue guarantees. He didn't reverse course. He listened. He acknowledged concerns. He emphasized process, technical language, risk management, domestic responsibility, the same calm vocabulary that markets interpret as resolve, not weakness. Trump had tried to play the strong man. Carney played the system. One man shouted into cameras, the other let governors beg for certainty. That's when it became clear this was never about insults or egos. It was about who actually understands leverage in a world run by grids, contracts, and flows. And Washington, for the first time, understood it was negotiating from downstream. What happened next exposed the difference between intimidation and strategy. Donald Trump knows only one lever: escalation, tariffs, threats, public humiliation. It's a playbook built for television, not infrastructure. It assumes the other side is as exposed, as centralized, and as emotionally reactive as he is. When it works, it looks decisive. When it doesn't, it collapses under its own noise. Canada didn't escalate, it recalibrated. Mark Carney never raised his voice because he didn't need to. He understood something Trump never has. Real power isn't about how hard you hit, it's about where you press. Supply chains are pressure points. Energy flows are arteries. Touch them carefully, and the whole body responds. Trump threatened tariffs as if they were weapons. But tariffs are blunt instruments. They take time. They trigger retaliation. They invite courts, carve-outs, and loopholes. Worse, they assume your opponent sells to you because they have no choice. Canada had a choice. By using energy reviews instead of sanctions, Carney avoided every trap escalation creates. No violation, no headline war, no legal trigger for immediate retaliation. Just a reminder that the United States industrial heartland runs on assumptions Canada helps sustain. This is chess versus checkers. Trump kept flipping pieces, hoping force would substitute for foresight. Carney moved one square, quietly, and forced the board to reorganize itself. Markets reacted. Governors panicked. Utilities paid more. And none of it could be undone with a speech. That's why the tariff threat backfired. It sounded strong, but landed hollow. Everyone downstream could do the math. Even if tariffs were imposed tomorrow, they wouldn't replace lost stability in energy supply. They wouldn't calm traders. They wouldn't lower power prices. They wouldn't keep the grade smooth. Trump's leverage was hypothetical. Canada's was structural. And structure always wins. This wasn't about who could shout louder or posture harder. It was about who understood the system well enough to bend it without breaking it, and without ever admitting they were doing it. The message to Washington was brutal and unmistakable. Escalation is easy. Control is rare. And in a world run by invisible networks, the country that controls the flows doesn't need to bully. It only needs to wait. By the end, the damage was already done, no matter how it officially resolved. 3 paths sat on the table. The first was quiet retreat. No apology, no announcement, just a gradual softening of tone, a mutual de-escalation disguised as normalization. This is how powerful states back down without admitting error. It would calm markets, stabilize grids, and let everyone pretend the episode never happened. Politically survivable, strategically humiliating. The second path was escalation, and it was the most dangerous.
Push harder, double down on tariffs, keep provoking. In that scenario, Canada wouldn't need to announce anything dramatic. Minor delays, stricter prioritization, tighter margins, enough friction to turn a stressed grid into rolling outages during peak demand. Not nationwide blackouts, localized failures, the kind that get blamed on weather, not policy. The third path ran through courts and regulators. Lawsuits, arbitration panels, emergency rulings. Slow, technical, and uncertain. Markets hate that option most of all. Legal fog is worse than bad news because it drags risk out over months or years. But here's the truth beneath all 3 outcomes. The relationship was already altered. Trust is the real currency of energy systems. Once it cracks, it never fully resets. Utilities plan differently. Investors demand premiums. Governments diversify suppliers, not because they want to, but because they have to. Reliability, once questioned, is permanently discounted. Canada understood this immediately. Regardless of how Washington chose to end the standoff, Canada began pivoting. More global contracts, deeper integration with Europe and Asia, less dependence on a neighbor willing to weaponize rhetoric without understanding infrastructure. You don't threaten the customer who lives downstream unless you're prepared to be replaced. For the United States, the lesson was harsher. A superpower accustomed to dominance discovered it was vulnerable, not militarily, not rhetorically, but systemically. Dependent on flows it doesn't fully control, exposed to leverage it rarely acknowledges. The kind of weakness that doesn't show up in speeches, but shows up on utility bills and balance sheets.
Donald Trump treated the moment like another performance. Mark Carney treated it like a stress test. Only one of those approaches revealed the future. Because in the modern world, power doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the biggest flag. It belongs to whoever controls the quiet systems everyone else takes for granted. And once those systems are seen, once the leverage is exposed, nothing ever goes back to the way it was. Core takeaways from the story. At its surface, this looked like a simple political insult. In reality, it revealed how power actually works in the modern world. Donald Trump used public provocation, expecting noise, emotion, and escalation. Mark Carney responded with silence, and then moved inside systems most people never see. Instead of rhetoric, Canada used energy dependence, supply chains, and market psychology as leverage. No treaties were broken, no threats were announced. Yet U.S. energy markets reacted immediately, costs rose, and ordinary Americans felt the pressure through higher bills. The conflict proved one thing clearly. In the 21st century, infrastructure beats intimidation. Lessons you can apply in real life. Silence can be stronger than reaction. Immediate emotional responses feel powerful, but they often give away leverage. Strategic patience creates uncertainty for your opponent and clarity for you. Real power is structural, not performative. Titles, volume, and confidence don't matter as much as control over systems, whether that's money, skills, relationships, or information. Know where you sit in the system. Upstream positions, control of resources, timing, and access always beat downstream dependence. In work and life, ask, who depends on whom? You don't need to break rules to win. The most effective moves stay within the rules while changing the outcome. Quiet leverage is harder to attack than open confrontation. Trust is an asset. Once damaged, it's never free again. Whether in business, friendships, or geopolitics, once reliability is questioned, every future interaction becomes more expensive. The positive message for the audience. This story isn't about fear,
It's about awareness and empowerment. You don't need to be louder, richer, or more aggressive to protect yourself or succeed. You need to understand systems, control what you can, and act with intention. Calm thinking beats loud reacting, preparation beats provocation, and quiet leverage beats brute force, every time. Call to Action, PT Audio YouTube channel. If you value clear thinking, strategic insight, and stories that reveal how power truly works, support the mission. Subscribe to PT Audio. Share this video with someone who values strategy over noise. Comment with your perspective. Where do you see hidden leverage in your own life? Your attention helps bring deeper, smarter conversations to more people. Disclaimer: this content is educational and analytical in nature. It does not claim insider knowledge, predict future events, or represent official positions of any government, institution, or individual. All scenarios discussed are interpretations based on publicly observable economic, political, and market dynamics. Viewers are encouraged to think critically and form their own conclusions.